I'm Pedro, and this is the Green Earth Podcast by DGP Group. And in this episode, I want to make you feel optimistic. One of the things that I noticed when this project started is how most of the content out there regarding sustainability falls into two categories. Either is something super serious and corporate with scientists and analysts going over data, reports, projections, and policies, or it's something super scary telling us that the world's about to end. And while I understand why that's the case, I actually believe there are many reasons for us to be optimistic about our future. And I wanted to talk about that in a way that anyone could understand. While learning about recent developments on global climate action, I couldn't help but think that, while not perfect, humans are pretty awesome. We're finding really interesting solutions for very, very complex problems, and this is what I want to focus on today. The very first topic that I want to address is progress can sometimes feel very slow. Especially today, when a problem gets fixed almost instantly by an app, it can feel like we're dragging and not doing anything. And that's why we need perspective. You cannot look at something and say it's fast or slow if you are not comparing it to something else. I'm very slow compared to Usain Bolt, but I'm very fast compared to a toddler who's just learning how to walk. So let me give you some perspective. Do you know how long it took for doctors to start washing their hands? I know it seems crazy, but in the past, doctors, including surgeons, did not think it was necessary to wash their hands or instruments. People have been performing surgery since ancient Egypt, about 5,000 years ago. And it was only in 1847 that a Hungarian obstetrician conducted an experiment and found out that patients were much more likely to survive if their doctor washed their hands. Crazy idea, I know. But then it took almost 100 years for the medical community to accept that quote-unquote invisible particles could actually cause disease. Only by the mid-20th century, after the First and Second World War, did washing hands become a well-established and required practice in medical settings globally. When you put this into perspective and consider that modern sustainability thinking started around the 1960s, things suddenly aren't so slow anymore, right? While doctors took almost 100 years of convincing to start washing their hands, it took much less time for all 197 nations of the world to sign a treaty committing to take sustainable action and limit global temperature increases by 2 degrees Celsius. That happened in 2015, and it's called the Paris Agreement. To learn about it, I spoke to Lev Gantly, a partner at Philip Lee LLP, specializing in domestic and international climate law. Here's Lev answering my question, what is the Paris Agreement?
The Paris Agreement is an agreement that was signed under the auspices of the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. And it was signed in 2015. There are 197 signatory countries, and it sort of marked a sort of first step towards committing to keeping temperature goals below 1.5 degrees if possible, but at the very least to 2 degrees Celsius. And it represented a reversal in approach from what we had in the UNFCCC days, which was a sort of top-down approach to a more bottom-up approach in the Paris Agreement, where countries have a lot more flexibility in deciding what they wish to do to try and reduce their national emissions.
What that means is that we're learning how to properly organize climate action on a global scale. That's quite a challenge. The Paris Agreement wasn't the first time nations attempted to reach an agreement on how to address our impact on the planet. The Kyoto Protocol in the 90s was actually the first major international treaty aimed at greenhouse gas emissions, but it wasn't particularly effective. It failed to take into account that different countries have different priorities, different energy needs, and of course, very, very different economic activities. And when we're trying to form a very large team, the largest team with the whole planet in it, we need to take into consideration that each member of this team has different needs and different capabilities. It's pretty much like a band. You wouldn't give a trombone to a guitar player and expect them to play the drums with it. But let's take a more realistic and relatable example, which everyone is almost tired of talking about when it comes to climate action: transportation. Let's take two different people from different places around the world and ask them to limit their carbon footprint. One person is Tim. He lives in a medium-sized city in Europe and works from home on his computer. Everything he needs is at walking distance, and the city is safe enough for him to walk everywhere. The temperature in the city he lives in is quite stable, and he doesn't need air conditioning to be able to live, move, or work comfortably. The other person is Anna. She lives in São Paulo, Brazil, working in an office during the day and going to college at night. Her home, the office she works in, and her school are too far away from each other for Anna to walk. She could take the bus, but her last class is at 11 p.m., and walking down the street to the bus station at night is just too dangerous. São Paulo is also very warm during the summer, and taking public transportation equals to sweating the whole journey to your office and getting there completely drenched and, of course, exhausted. And your day hasn't even started yet. Now, would it be fair to ask both Tim and Anna to sell their personal vehicle in order to lower their emissions? Mind you, to Tim, that probably means having to wait a little bit longer for the train every now and then. And actually, it would kind of mean like a more healthy lifestyle since he will exercise more walking around everywhere. But for Anna, it will mean putting herself in very uncomfortable, stressful, and even dangerous situations. Those are very different things, right? Now, that doesn't mean that Anna and Tim can't both contribute and join the team to take climate action. But it does mean that they will contribute in different ways, and they require different kinds of support. This is one thing that we learned from the Kyoto Protocol and actually applied in the Paris Agreement. And for me, it's something we should be very happy about. As with anything we humans do, we need to try and fail multiple times to learn from it, improve, and then try again until eventually we succeed. And the way that the Paris Agreement actually works is through something called NDCs. So NDCs are nationally determined contributions, and they are basically the commitment that each country makes in order to contribute towards the agreement's goal of limiting global temperature increases by 2 degrees Celsius. Each country will submit their NDCs by the end of 2024, and they're supposed to be enhanced every 5 years. With this sort of bottom-up approach, countries are much more likely to be able to reach their goals and stay engaged with the agreement, thus increasing the chances of the agreement being a success. One of the main challenges in the journey towards sustainability is economic development. When you look at a developing country that's still struggling to raise people out of poverty, it's very unrealistic to ask them to limit their economic activities to meet carbon targets. There's this idea that we need to sacrifice the economy for the sake of the environment, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. In fact, I think this is a general image problem for anything sustainable. Most people have the idea that we need to give something up in exchange for sustainability. I mean, everyone working in advertising knows that if you label a product quote-unquote green or nature-friendly, the public will see it as less effective or in general lower quality. This is, of course, a completely emotional reaction, just like when you perceive something as less tasty because it's advertised as healthy or low sugar. In fact, I can think of many sustainable solutions or products that can be considered even better than their polluting competitors. Things that people will choose not because they're green, but because they're actually perceived as better. For example, LED light bulbs are much better than the old traditional ones. One could argue that an economic example of this is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. This article pretty much outlines an international platform for financing carbon projects. Remember when we talked about companies and individuals purchasing carbon units as part of their sustainability strategy? This is pretty much the same thing, but for whole countries. And it could be an alternative for developing countries that still want to grow economically while moving towards sustainability.
Yeah, so it's the only market-based mechanism that is integrated into the Paris Agreement. Article 6 is about a page long, and it consists of 8 sub-articles. Sort of primary ones, like the market mechanisms themselves, are in paragraph 6.2 and 6.4. But 6.1 actually sets out what the purpose of Article 6 is, and I keep repeating this as often as I can because I think people generally tend to forget. The purpose of Article 6 is for it to be voluntary. So it encourages voluntary activities by countries that want to enhance the ambition in their nationally determined contributions. The point of Article 6 is to encourage cooperation between countries in reducing emissions and through financing of mitigation activities, so essentially carbon projects, in exchange for the transfer of what we call IPMOs, which are internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So in its essence, the purpose of Article 6 is, so first of all, it's voluntary, right? It's a voluntary activity that countries or party to the Paris Agreement can undertake, but they don't have to. And its purpose is to enhance ambition in NDCs towards global climate goals.
With instruments such as Article 6, the Paris Agreement articulates opportunities for finance in developing countries hosting carbon projects. And remember, a high-quality carbon project isn't just about the carbon removal. It also has exponential benefits for local communities, economy, and governments. They create jobs, train new professionals, raise the quality of life of the people, and much more. And with this in mind, nations have the option to invest in projects like these because they're actually better, like an LED bulb. The fact that they are sustainable is just another positive aspect, not the whole thing. In my opinion, this is a very productive way to help a developing country be more sustainable. It's not like you're setting an arbitrary limit that will make it even more difficult for this nation to develop. You're actually providing a plan, another path that can be even better. This podcast is brought to you by DGB Group. As a project developer of high-quality, large-scale, nature-based projects accredited by leading verification standards, DGB focuses on nature conservation and helping biodiversity flourish and prosper by assisting governments and corporations in achieving net zero and investing in nature. To learn more, access co2.expert and take the first step towards your sustainability goals. Now, you're probably asking yourself, if exporting ITMOs under Article 6 is a financial incentive for developing countries, how can we make sure that there's a balance between economic and sustainable development? In other words, how can we make sure that this actually causes the positive global impact we're looking for? This is one of the fundamental differences between the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. In the Kyoto Protocol, only developed countries would commit to reducing their emissions. But in the Paris Agreement,
everyone has a target. Global North and Global South countries have got emission reduction targets that are communicated through their NDCs and are supposed to be enhanced every 5 years. So why does that matter? It matters because it brings a lot of jeopardy, right? And where's the jeopardy? The jeopardy is in the fact that Global South countries have to be very careful in terms of what they are authorizing for finance purposes under Article 6, because when they do that and they're exporting the carbon under the Article 6 regime, they have to apply what's called the corresponding adjustment, which is an accounting adjustment to their national emissions ledger, whereby they have to account for the fact that they cannot count that exported and sold ton for their own national emissions reporting in accordance with their NDCs. So the jeopardy there is that they shouldn't oversell, and what they do sell, they need to price at such a point to bring in sufficient money to allow them to enhance their NDCs and finance sustainable development in other sectors of their economies. If that makes sense? So that's where the jeopardy comes in. Everyone has a target, and again, in the previous regime under the Kyoto Protocol, only Global North countries had a target. So that's the sort of fundamental difference between where we were under the Kyoto regime and where we are now under the Paris regime.
And what are the consequences on that? If we're talking about jeopardy, let's say a country is exporting and it's not using those ITMOs for their own NDCs. What can happen to this country? What are the consequences of it?
Well, so the consequences of it, I think if it oversells, it runs the risk of not achieving the ambitions that it set out in its NDC, which remember are the 5-year cyclical climate action plans essentially that each country has to submit. Now, what are the penalties under the Paris Agreement for doing that? There aren't any. So what's the downside in selling as much as you can and bringing as much finance in as possible? I think it's the loss of the integrity of the system. And, it's a transparent system. Article 6 requires a lot of reporting. So every time authorizations are made, a host country has to report and submit documentation to the UNFCCC, which explains why the country has authorized these credits, how it's still on track to achieve its NDC, where the export and authorization of these credits fits within its plans to achieve its NDC, how it's going to enhance ambition in its next NDC cycle. So there's a lot of transparency around that. And there's also review frameworks by UNFCCC bodies that are under development that will review and assess if countries are doing all this correctly. And the reality is that some of these reports a lot of them will be publicly available on the UNFCCC website. And the reality is that if a country is found to be actively overselling for the sake of bringing in finance and not really caring about meeting its NDC and not really caring about enhancing its ambition, which it's supposed to do under Article 6.1, then everyone will know about it. And then that will stymie investment into that country for Article 6 activities. I think that's the absent penalties, which don't exist in the Paris Agreement. That's the logical conclusion that I think folks in the market generally arrived at when we're discussing this particular topic.
As you can see, the Paris Agreement is a very thorough treaty, and it can be even considered a sort of quote-unquote improvement of the Kyoto Protocol. That doesn't mean that it's completely flawless and there is no room for improvement, but it's clearly a strong sign not only that we're constantly evolving and improving our solutions, but most importantly, we're actually focusing, spending time and resources on this. By signing the Paris Agreement, every nation on the planet has agreed that this is where the world is moving towards, and that sustainability is the next big focus for humanity. If you want to learn more about the Paris Agreement, check out DGB's YouTube channel. We have a live stream with Lev there, and we explored this agreement in much more detail. Thank you for joining us today. The Green Earth Podcast is a DGB Group initiative. DGB is a large-scale, nature-based project developer, and our goal is to help nature flourish and prosper. If you want to read more about our projects and opportunities, please check our website, green.earth. The link is also in the description. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider leaving us a review. And if you know anyone that might benefit from this content, we'd greatly appreciate your recommendation. I'm Pedro Zimmer, your host, and I hope to see you for the next episode of the Green Earth Podcast.